Renee Halston ripped the $2 million check from Marcus Bell's hand and tore it in half in front of his 20-year-old daughter. "Men like you don't walk in here with this kind of money," she said, looking him up and down like something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. Then she picked up the phone and called the police to report fraud. Marcus put a hand on his daughter Sophie's shoulder and told Renee, calmly, that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. As the branch's security guard moved to walk him toward the door, Renee's regional director stepped through the entrance, saw the torn paper scattered across the tile, and went pale. "Mr. Bell," he said. "Why? Before we get into it, if stories like this one hit home for you, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one." Now let's go back to where it all started. Marcus Bell had learned a long time ago that most rooms decided who he was before he ever opened his mouth. He was 44 years old, and for the last 18 years he had raised his daughter alone in a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of Ridgefield, a town small enough that nobody looked twice at his 10-year-old pickup truck or the gray hoodie he'd owned since before Sophie was in grade school. Her mother had left when Sophie was 2, chasing a different life in a different city, and Marcus had simply kept going, because stopping had never once felt like an option. He'd packed her lunches through high school, sat through every recital and every parent-teacher conference, driven her to and from campus every semester since she'd started college 2 towns over, even on the weeks his work kept him awake until sunrise. Nobody at Sophie's university knew that the tired man in the faded hoodie who dropped off boxes on move-in day had built Bell Meridian Partners from the 2-desk office into a firm that quietly managed billions of dollars for pension funds and endowments across the country. Marcus preferred it that way. He hadn't wanted his daughter growing up believing a person's worth could be read off a price tag, and even now, watching her study finance in the same city where his firm had offices, he never once tried to open doors for her that she hadn't earned herself. He drove the same truck he'd bought used 9 years ago, wore the same watch his own father had given him, and kept his success folded so far into the background of ordinary life that only the handful of people who needed to know knew. That Tuesday, Sophie was home for a few days between semesters, and a wire had cleared into Marcus's account that same morning. The final payout from an early stake he'd taken in a logistics startup nobody had heard of until it went public. The bank had converted a portion of it into a physical check at his request, for reasons that would matter later. Marcus already knew where the money was going. Half would go into a trust that would mature once Sophie finished her degree. The other half was seed money for a scholarship fund for kids being raised by a single parent, the exact life he understood better than almost anyone he knew, and the life Sophie had lived right alongside him. He asked her to ride along because they had plans for the rest of the day, plans she'd been talking about since breakfast. First the bank, then the bookstore near campus for the textbooks she still needed. Then dinner at the diner with the window seat she'd loved since she was a kid. It was supposed to be the easiest stop of the afternoon, a formality, before the two of them went back to being just father and daughter instead of founder and finance major. He'd even told her lunch was on him, since he was in a good mood. Neither of them expected the stop to take more than 10 minutes. They walked into the Brookline branch of Ashford National Bank a little before closing. Marcus had banked there for 13 years. Since before Sophie was born, since before Bell Meridian had a name anyone outside a small circle of institutional investors would recognize. But the woman behind the manager's desk that afternoon, Renee Halston, had transferred to that branch only a month earlier. She didn't know his history. She'd never once pulled up his account. She had no idea the man in the hoodie had been a fixture of that building's ledgers for over a decade before she'd ever set foot inside it. Renee's eyes moved over Marcus the moment he walked in, then to Sophie beside him, then out to the truck he'd parked at the curb. Other customers who came through in blazers and heels were greeted before they'd cleared the doorway. Marcus and Sophie stood at the counter for nearly 5 minutes while 3 tellers stayed idle, none of them calling the two of them forward. Sophie leaned toward her father and asked, under her breath, why nobody was helping them yet. Marcus told her it never paid to assume the worst about people before they'd earned it. When he finally reached the counter, he set the check down and asked for it to be deposited into the account he'd held for 13 years. The number caught the teller's eye immediately, and within seconds Renee was standing behind the counter herself. Instead of pulling up his account, something any manager could have done in under a minute, she began questioning him loudly enough that half the lobby could hear. Marcus answered every question without losing his composure. He handed over his driver's license, his debit card, his account number, and the paperwork from the sale of his shares. He offered to let her call the issuing institution directly so she could verify everything herself in a matter of minutes. It was, by any reasonable measure, More than enough for a transaction that should have taken no time at all. Renee looked at the documents without really looking at them. She told Marcus that a man carrying a $6 million check wouldn't be driving a truck like his or wearing a hoodie like that. A young teller named Nina Cortez offered to make the verification call herself. Renee cut her off before she could reach for the phone, ordering her back to her station in a tone that left no room for discussion. By then, several customers had noticed the tension building at the counter, and a few had already taken out their phones. One man said, loud enough for Sophie to hear, that a guy like that was probably using his own daughter to make a scam look more convincing. Nobody in the lobby spoke up against it. They simply kept their phones raised, waiting to see what happened next. Sophie stepped half a step closer to her father, her jaw tight, the easy confidence she'd walked in with draining out of her all at once. Marcus kept his voice level and asked Renee, one more time, to call the issuing bank before this went any further. His calm only seemed to provoke her. In front of the tellers, the security guard, and every customer still filming, Renee announced that the check was fraudulent, though she hadn't verified a single detail of it. Marcus reminded her, evenly, that she was handling a customer's legitimate assets and should think carefully about what she did next. Renee heard the reminder as a threat instead of a warning. She snatched the check off the counter, looked Marcus dead in the eye, and told him people like him didn't walk in here with $6 million. Then she tore it in half, and then into smaller pieces, and let them fall to the floor at his feet, in full view of his daughter. The lobby went silent. Sophie crouched like she meant to gather the pieces herself. Marcus put a hand on her shoulder and stopped her, unwilling to let his daughter kneel on that floor to collect what someone had just used to humiliate him. He looked at Renee and told her, without raising his voice, that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. Renee called the police, telling the dispatcher a man was using fraudulent documents, threatening staff, and refusing to leave the premises. He ordered the branch's security guard, a man named Miguel Torres, to escort Marcus out of the building. Miguel hesitated before stepping forward, unsure why he was being told to remove a man who had done nothing but stand quietly at a counter. But a direct order from his manager, in front of a lobby full of witnesses, left him little room to argue. Sophie squared her shoulders toward the guard, her voice sharper now than fear, telling him he had no reason to put a hand on her father. Marcus caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent request to let this play out rather than escalate it further. He understood the position he was in. He could resist and risk turning a bad situation into something dangerous with his daughter standing beside him, or he could stay calm and let the truth catch up to the moment. He chose the second option, though he also refused to walk out the door before someone confirmed what he already knew. He looked down at the torn pieces scattered across the tile, the remnants of a scholarship fund that hadn't even had the chance to exist yet, and felt something harden in his chest that had nothing to do with anger. It was closer to certainty. Somewhere in the last 10 minutes, this had stopped being about a check and started being about every assumption a room full of strangers had made about him before he'd said a single word. Miguel's grip stayed light on Marcus's arm as they moved toward the glass doors. Sophie couldn't stop looking back at the torn paper still scattered on the floor. She walked close beside her father, one hand gripping his forearm, and told the guard flatly that this was a mistake he'd regret making. Miguel's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, caught between a manager's order and the plain evidence in front of him. Renee called out from behind the counter, telling one of the tellers to keep Sophie back so she couldn't interfere with an officer of the bank doing his job. It was the first time Marcus's calm cracked. He'd absorbed the accusations, the insults about his truck and his clothes, even the humiliation of watching his own money torn apart in front of strangers. But the moment someone suggested putting a hand on his daughter, his voice changed entirely. He told the teller, in a tone that left no room for negotiation, that no one was to touch Sophie. Renee seized on the reaction immediately, telling the gathering crowd that his sudden intensity was proof of exactly the aggression she'd been warning them about since he walked in. Marcus understood, in that instant, that every word out of his mouth and every motion of his body was being read through a lens that had already decided who he was. He lowered his voice, kept his hands visible, and stepped slightly in front of Sophie rather than beside her. It struck him how quickly a father's instinct to protect his daughter could be twisted into evidence against him. He'd spent nearly 2 decades building a life where Sophie never had to see him lose his composure. Now a stranger behind a counter was rewriting that same protectiveness into something dangerous, simply because it suited the story she'd already decided to tell. Nina spoke up again, the second time she'd tried to intervene. She reminded Renee, as steadily as she could manage, that Marcus hadn't threatened anyone, and that a single phone call would settle the entire matter in minutes. Renee turned on her instead, threatening to fire her on the spot if she said another word in front of customers who were still filming. Nina didn't back down entirely, but she stopped talking, aware that losing her job would help no one in that lobby, least of all the man standing beside his daughter. She'd only worked at the branch a little over a year, and she'd watched Renee dismiss more than one customer in ways that never sat right with her. She told herself each time it wasn't her place to say anything. Watching Sophie's face go tight with barely held back anger, she understood that whatever she'd told herself before no longer held up. The customers who'd been recording kept recording. Nobody lowered a phone to speak up. Nobody stepped between Renee and the family she was taking apart in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. They wanted the spectacle. None of them wanted to be the first person to risk anything by standing on the side of a stranger. Sophie looked around the lobby at all the raised phones and the lowered eyes and asked, just loud enough to carry, if nobody was going to say he'd done nothing wrong. Several people looked away. Nobody answered. Nobody moved. But silence landed on Marcus harder than anything Renee had said, because he understood, watching his daughter's face, that even at 20, in a moment like this, she was still learning something about the world that nobody should have to learn in a bank lobby on an ordinary afternoon. And Miguel walked Marcus and Sophie toward the front doors, his hand resting on Marcus's shoulder rather than gripping it, as though some part of him didn't want to be doing this even as he did it. The lobby had gone quiet except for the murmur of phones still recording and the low hum of overhead lights that suddenly seemed far too loud. Marcus counted his steps the way he sometimes counted his breaths during a difficult negotiation, a habit that kept his mind from racing ahead into anger. Sophie stayed half a pace behind him, her arms crossed tight, her earlier fire cooling into a controlled, simmering focus. Renee watched them go with her arms crossed, apparently satisfied the matter had been handled correctly, unaware that the man walking toward the exit held more influence over her branch's future than she could have imagined 10 minutes earlier. At that exact moment, the door swung open, and Walter Kessler walked in, a leather portfolio under one arm and the unhurried posture of a man expecting an uneventful late-afternoon meeting. Walter was the regional director for Ashford National's Eastern Division, and he'd come to the Brookline branch specifically to meet Marcus after hours, away from the attention a public sit-down might draw. The two of them were finalizing a deal worth $900 million between the bank and Bell Meridian partners, months in the making, scheduled to close within the week. Walter took 2 steps inside before he understood what he was looking at. Marcus Bell, the man he'd been preparing to meet for the better part of an hour, stood with a security guard's hand on his shoulder, his daughter standing rigid beside him with her arms folded and her eyes hard. Scraps of paper were scattered across the floor near his feet, and Walter didn't need anyone to explain what they'd once been. His portfolio slipped from his hand and hit the tile with a heavy thud. "Mr. Bell," he said, his voice carrying across the lobby with an authority that turned every head. Miguel released Marcus's arm immediately, stepping back as though the shoulder he'd been holding had suddenly become something he had no right to touch. Renee moved toward Walter and began explaining quickly that she'd just prevented what she believed was a $6 million fraud attempt. Walter looked at her for a long moment before asking whether she had any idea who she was talking about. Renee opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing for the first time that the question wasn't rhetorical. She glanced at Marcus, then at Sophie, then back at Walter, searching for some version of the last 10 minutes that might still make sense. Around the lobby, customers who'd spent the last several minutes recording a criminal lowered their phones just enough to exchange confused glances. "Wait," a woman near the entrance whispered to the man beside her. "Is this a misunderstanding?" Nobody answered, because nobody yet understood how large that misunderstanding actually was. In front of every customer still in the lobby, Walter explained that Marcus Bell was the founder of Bell Meridian Partners, one of the largest institutional clients the bank currently held. He explained that Bell Meridian was in the final stages of a $900 million agreement with Ashford National, and that Marcus was the only person with the authority to approve or walk away from it. The $6,000 check, he added, was entirely legitimate. The issuing institution had sent confirmation that same morning, a confirmation Renee had never once bothered to check before deciding what she believed about the man at her counter. Walter turned to Sophie next and apologized to her directly for what she'd just watched happen inside a bank that carried his name on its letterhead. It was the first time since they'd walked through the doors that anyone in the building had spoken to her as though what she'd witnessed actually mattered. And for a moment the hard set of her jaw softened, just slightly, as she looked between Walter and her father. 2 words had been enough to reverse everything. The customers who'd been filming lowered their phones, though none of them deleted the footage. The tellers behind the counter exchanged uneasy glances, some suddenly finding paperwork to busy themselves with. The man who'd loudly accused Marcus of using his own daughter to sell a scam now stood near the door, studying his shoes, making no effort to apologize or meet anyone's eyes. Sophie noticed him too, and something in her expression made clear she hadn't forgotten a word of what he'd said. Renee straightened her blazer and cleared her throat, as though composure alone might undo the last 10 minutes. She recovered quickly, though rather than accepting responsibility, she insisted Marcus bore some blame for the entire incident, arguing that a man carrying $6 million should have dressed the part, or at least identified himself the moment he walked in, as if the burden of preventing his own humiliation had rested on him instead of her. Marcus asked her, without raising his voice, whether a customer needed to be wealthy before he deserved basic decency. Renee answered by insisting she'd only been following procedure, repeating the word twice, as though saying it often enough might make it true. Walter gestured at the torn paper still on the floor and asked her to name the exact procedure that authorized a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal property in front of his family. "There is no such procedure, Renee," he said flatly. "There never has been." Renee's face flushed. She started to say protocol again and caught herself, aware the word had already failed her once. She fumbled for an answer and found none. She looked around the lobby, at the tellers who wouldn't meet her eyes, at the customers still holding their phones, and seemed, for the first time, to understand that no one in the room was going to help her out of the corner she'd backed herself into. Instead of answering, she pivoted again, this time suggesting that Sophie's presence had made the situation more volatile than it needed to be, implying the two of them together had somehow escalated things. That comment was the moment Sophie stepped forward before her father could say a word, her voice steady and cold, asking Renee exactly what about a daughter standing beside her own father was supposed to be threatening. Renee had no answer, and Marcus, watching his daughter hold her ground without flinching, felt something in his chest loosen for the first time since they'd walked through the doors. Walter ordered Renee to surrender her badge and her keys immediately, and instructed her not to touch her computer or her phone under any circumstances. Every file and note attached to her station that day would be preserved for an internal investigation. He told her in front of everyone still standing in the lobby, his voice carrying the flat finality of a decision that wouldn't be reversed by an apology. While attention stayed fixed on Marcus and Walter, Renee slipped quietly behind her terminal and tried to delete an internal note she'd added to his account minutes earlier, one describing him as a high-risk, potentially fraudulent customer. Her fingers moved fast across the keyboard, as though she believed the matter could still be cleaned up if she moved quickly enough. Nina caught the movement out of the corner of her eye. They crossed the lobby before Renee could finish, placed a hand firmly over the keyboard, and stopped the deletion mid-motion. She told Renee plainly that the note needed to stay exactly where it was, then turned to Walter and told him the branch's security cameras had recorded the entire incident from multiple angles, including the moment Renee tore the check apart in front of Sophie. Renee's face went pale at the mention of the cameras, as if she'd forgotten entirely that the whole exchange had been captured on film from the moment Marcus walked through the door. Walter terminated her on the spot, right there in the lobby, in front of the same customers who'd watched her tear the check apart less than 10 minutes earlier. Renee asked to have the conversation privately in an office. Walter refused. He told her plainly that she'd humiliated Mr. Bell in public, and she would answer for it in front of the same people who'd witnessed it, not tucked behind a closed door where the consequences might quietly disappear. Turning to Miguel, Walter took a more measured approach. The footage showed he'd never used force against Marcus, and had released him the instant Walter spoke. Walter suspended him pending a full review rather than terminating him outright. Telling him the time off would give both of them a chance to look at the footage clearly before deciding anything permanent. Miguel's shoulders dropped, something between relief and shame. He admitted, quietly, that he should have questioned Renee's order the moment it was given instead of following it simply because it came from someone above him. "I knew something felt wrong," he said, mostly to himself. "I just didn't trust that feeling enough to say so." Marcus, standing beside his daughter, found he had no anger left for the guard, who'd at least had the decency to hesitate before every step, unlike the woman who'd ordered him to. The police arrived not long after, responding to the call Renee had placed earlier describing a black man attempting fraud and threatening staff. 2 officers walked in scanning the lobby, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt the same tightening in his chest he'd felt when Miguel's hand first landed on his arm. A reflexive bracing for another round of assumptions before anyone asked him a single question. Walter tried to explain that the initial report had been false, but the responding officers still had to file an incident report, since Renee's original call had already been logged before anyone corrected the record. One officer apologized for the inconvenience while taking down Marcus's account, admitting under his breath that dispatch had made the situation sound far more serious than what they were seeing in front of them. Marcus stood through the questioning with Sophie beside him, answering each question calmly, even though the whole process felt like a formality dragging out a humiliation that should have already ended the moment Walter walked through the door. Sophie gave her own account without being asked twice, laying out exactly what she'd witnessed in clear, unhurried detail, unwilling to let a single part of it get softened for anyone's comfort. Nina gave her account without hesitation, describing exactly what she'd seen and heard from the moment Marcus and Sophie first walked in, including the moment Renee had threatened to fire her for offering to make a phone call. Several customers who'd recorded the confrontation came forward too, handing over video that showed exactly what Renee had said and done from the moment the check hit the counter to the moment it hit the floor in pieces. A few apologized to Marcus directly while they waited, admitting they should have said something the moment the questioning started instead of only reaching for their phones. One 11-second clip. Renee tearing the check and letting the pieces fall at Marcus's feet while Sophie stood frozen beside him was online, before the police had even finished taking statements inside the branch. By the time Marcus and Sophie finally left the building that evening, the video already had thousands of views, a number that would multiply many times over before the night was through. Within hours, the clip had spread far beyond Ridgefield, reaching national attention almost overnight. News vans appeared outside the Brookline branch before the sun had set, and reporters stood outside the same glass doors Marcus had been walked toward less than a day earlier. Reporters quickly learned that Marcus was a single father who'd raised his daughter alone for 18 years. And that the $6.2 million Renee had torn apart was meant to help launch a scholarship fund for children being raised by single parents, just like Sophie had been. Old photos of Marcus dropping Sophie off at school years earlier surfaced online, alongside interviews from neighbors who described him as a quiet, private man who'd never once mentioned the size of his company to anyone in town. The contrast between what the money was actually meant to do and how its owner had been treated only deepened the outrage with every new share and every new headline. Commentators debated the footage for days. The phrase Renee had used at the counter, that people like him didn't walk in with that kind of money, was repeated across every major outlet until it was impossible to escape. Local stations replayed the clip during every broadcast that week, often followed by panels of guests arguing over what it revealed about how banks treated their customers. A few outlets tracked down Renee's prior employment history and uncovered complaints from years earlier that had never made it past an internal file. Ashford National's stock began sliding as the video circulated, and the board convened an emergency session that evening, putting pressure on Walter to do whatever was necessary to keep Marcus from walking away from the $900 million deal. Walter spent most of that night on the phone fielding calls from executives who cared far more about the falling stock price than about the young woman who'd watched her father accused of fraud in front of a room full of strangers. He answered every call the same way. The only path forward was full accountability, whether or not it was the answer anyone wanted to hear. More than one executive suggested quietly settling with Marcus before the story grew any larger. Walter refused each time, telling them plainly that Marcus Bell didn't strike him as a man who could be bought into silence, and that trying would likely make things far worse for everyone involved. An internal investigation launched in the following days uncovered a pattern far larger than a single afternoon at a single branch. Renee had a documented history of freezing or denying accounts belonging to black customers and lower-income customers, and previous complaints against her had been quietly dismissed by branch leadership long before Marcus ever walked through those doors. Investigators found more than a dozen prior complaints sitting untouched in old files, each one closed without any real review. Employees who'd stayed silent about her behavior for years were suddenly being asked why nothing had ever been done. Some admitted they'd assumed complaints were being handled above their level. Others confessed they'd simply been afraid of losing their own jobs. One former teller who'd left the branch nearly 2 years earlier told investigators she'd reported an almost identical incident involving an elderly customer whose account Renee had frozen without explanation. A complaint, like the others, had been closed within a week, buried in a file nobody had reason to reopen until a $6.2 million check ended up torn on the same lobby floor. What had started as one manager's mistake was quickly becoming proof that an entire system had allowed discriminatory behavior to continue unchecked for years. Within 48 hours, the police formally closed their case, confirming there had been no fraud and no threat of any kind from Marcus, and noting for the record that Renee's original report had been false from the start. A small measure of official vindication that did little to undo what Sophie had already witnessed. Renee lost her job and now faced the possibility of losing her banking license altogether, along with a discrimination lawsuit and a formal charge for filing a false police report. Lawyers representing several of her past customers began reaching out within days, asking whether they too had grounds to come forward now that her history was finally being examined. Marcus's phone didn't stop ringing that first night, filled with messages from reporters, lawyers, and even a few distant acquaintances who'd never once called before but suddenly wanted to know if the rumors were true. He let almost every call go to voicemail, choosing instead to sit with Sophie and let the noise outside their small house in Ridgefield stay exactly where it belonged, on the other side of a door he had no plans to open that evening. But the sharpest blow of all didn't come from the board, the lawyers, or the reporters calling for comment. It came from Sophie later that evening, as she sat across from her father at their kitchen table, picking at a dinner neither of them had much appetite for. She looked up and asked whether anyone would have apologized at all if they hadn't found out he was rich. Marcus set down his fork and looked at his daughter for a long moment, searching for an answer that wouldn't feel like a lie. He'd been cleared because he happened to hold power most people never would. But he understood, sitting there with her question hanging in the air, that thousands of other people walked into banks just like that one every single day without a regional director arriving in time to call them sir. He thought about all the videos and headlines already circulating his name, all the strangers online arguing about what had happened to him, and realized that almost none of them were asking the questions Sophie had just asked at their own kitchen table. Everyone wanted to talk about the check. Almost nobody wanted to talk about what happened to the people who didn't happen to be carrying one worth $6 million, or the ones who never got a chance to have their names cleared on the evening news. Sophie didn't let it go the way a younger kid might have. She pressed further, telling her father she didn't want an apology that only existed because Walter had recognized his name. She wanted to know what he was actually going to do about it. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, realizing his daughter wasn't asking out of anger anymore. She was asking because she expected an answer, the same way she'd expect one from any professor or any employer someday. He didn't have one yet, but he understood, watching her, that he owed her more than silence. The lawyers arrived at Marcus's house 3 days later, dressed in suits that looked out of place against the modest porch, and the truck parked in the driveway. They came with an offer already prepared, a financial settlement, a public apology from the bank, and the termination of several employees, all in exchange for one simple condition. Marcus would sign the $900 million agreement as planned and say nothing further about what had happened inside the Brookline branch. He laid the paperwork out across his kitchen table, the same table where Sophie had asked her question 3 nights earlier, and walked him through the numbers as though the size of the settlement alone might be enough to settle the matter. Sophie sat in on the meeting this time, arms crossed, saying nothing, but making it clear with her presence that she expected to be part of whatever came next. Marcus let the lawyers finish before he said anything at all. He was aware that a single signature from him could still cost Ashford National hundreds of millions of dollars and end more than one career at the top of the company. Part of him wanted to walk away entirely, take Sophie somewhere far from cameras and reporters and never set foot inside another Ashford branch again. But he thought about her question from that first night, the one that had followed him into every quiet moment since. If nobody had known he was rich, would anyone have apologized at all? He understood that punishing Renee and pressuring the bank into a public statement would satisfy his own anger. But it would do nothing for the next person who walked into a bank without a regional director waiting nearby to vouch for them. He thought about the customers who'd stood in that lobby with their phones raised, recording everything and saying nothing, and about how easily an entire room had agreed, through silence, to let an injustice happen in front of them. Punishing one manager wouldn't change that kind of silence. Only something built to outlast the headlines might have a chance. He thought, too, about Miguel's admission that he'd known something felt wrong and hadn't trusted himself enough to act on it, and about how many other employees across the country probably carried that same quiet doubt without ever being given permission to speak it out loud. If the bank walked away from this having only fired one manager, nothing underneath her would have actually changed. The challenge in front of him was no longer proving that a $2 million check was real. It was proving that power, once handed to someone who had felt its absence, could be used to protect the people who never got the chance to hold any of it themselves. Marcus told the lawyers he'd keep the deal on the table, but he refused the personal settlement outright, saying he had no interest in being paid to stay quiet. Instead, he laid out a list of conditions that had nothing to do with his own bank account, and everything to do with what happened the next time someone without his last name walked through those doors. A list Sophie had helped him draft the night before, having pulled up half a dozen studies on lending discrimination for him without being asked. Every branch would undergo an independent audit for discriminatory conduct, conducted by outside investigators rather than the bank's own compliance office. Any decision to freeze or deny a customer's account would require sign-off from a second manager before it could take effect. Customers would have the explicit right to request independent verification whenever a dispute arose. Instead of being left at the mercy of a single employee's judgment, employees who reported wrongdoing would be protected from retaliation. A condition Marcus insisted on directly because of what he'd watched happen to Nina in the middle of that lobby. Frontline staff, including security personnel like Miguel, would receive training on when and how to question an order that was clearly wrong, instead of following it simply because it came from someone above them. Security footage and transaction records could no longer be deleted once a complaint had been filed against an employee. Customer rights would be posted publicly inside every branch, in plain language anyone could read while waiting in line. The bank would be required to publicly disclose how it had handled every ignored complaint from the past, including the ones already buried in old files before Marcus ever walked through the doors of the Brookline branch. Finally, Ashford National would fund a permanent financial assistance program for single-parent families, aided with the same money that had once been torn apart on a lobby floor. The board resisted at first, arguing that some of the conditions went far beyond what any single incident required. But with the deal and the company's reputation both hanging in the balance, they had little room left to negotiate. Walter sat through most of the negotiations himself, reminding the board more than once that the cost of refusing Marcus's terms would almost certainly exceed the cost of accepting them. Within the week, every condition had been accepted and written into the final agreement, alongside a public timeline for when each change would take effect across every branch in the region. Renee's banking license was permanently revoked, and she now faced a civil rights lawsuit alongside the charge for filing a false police report. Employees who'd helped bury previous complaints against her were placed under formal review as well, closing out a pattern of silence that had protected her for years longer than it should have. Miguel was reinstated once the investigation confirmed what the footage had already shown, that he'd never used force against Marcus and had released him the instant he was told to. He was placed into the very training program Marcus had insisted on, learning alongside other staff how to recognize and refuse an order that crossed a clear line. When he saw Marcus again weeks later, he apologized quietly, admitting he wished he'd trusted his own instincts sooner instead of waiting for someone else to give him permission to do the right thing. Marcus told him there was nothing left to apologize for, that he remembered clearly how Miguel's hand had never once tightened on his arm, and how he'd let go the instant Walter spoke. It was a small distinction, but one Marcus had carried with him in the weeks since, and he wanted Miguel to know it hadn't gone unnoticed. Nina was kept on and promoted to assistant branch manager, a new role that put her in charge of rolling out the teller training program across the region. All because she'd been the only person in that lobby willing to speak up while everyone else stayed silent. Marcus made a point of thanking her personally before he left the branch that day, telling her that her willingness to say something out loud had mattered more than she probably realized in the moment. The bank issued a replacement check once the original had been formally voided, and Marcus split the money exactly as he'd always planned. Half went into the trust for Sophie, releasing once she finished her degree. The other half became the seed money for the Bell Family Scholarship, a program built to support children of mothers and fathers raising kids on their own, the way he once had. Marcus insisted that the very first round of scholarships be administered out of the Brookline branch itself, the same building that had once refused to believe he belonged there. A place that had turned him and his daughter away would now be responsible for handing opportunity to families who looked a great deal like his own. 3 months later, Marcus and Sophie walked back through those same glass doors. He still drove the same truck and wore the same hoodie, unwilling to change anything about himself simply because the world had briefly decided his appearance mattered more than it should have. Sophie walked beside him with an easy stride this time, nothing tense in it, just the comfort of an adult daughter running an ordinary errand with her father between semesters. The bank, though, looked different in ways that went beyond fresh paint or new signage. An employee greeted them the moment they stepped inside, asking how she could help before either of them had said a word. Nobody's eyes lingered on Marcus's hoodie or his keys before deciding how he should be treated. And for the first time since that first visit, Sophie didn't need to say anything about how they were being treated at all. A new placard stood near the entrance listing every customer's rights in plain language, along with a number for an independent complaint line that had nothing to do with the branch itself. Nina came over to greet them in her new role, mentioning that the first round of staff training had already rolled out across the entire region, and that early feedback from other branches had been better than anyone expected. Miguel stood near the door in his uniform, and when he caught sight of Marcus, he offered a small, genuine nod, a far cry from the tense hesitation Marcus remembered from 3 months earlier. None of the customers who'd once stood filming with their phones raised ever came back to that branch again, and Marcus noticed their absence without needing to say anything about it, understanding that some kinds of silence simply chose to stay hidden rather than be confronted. A small plaque near the wall bore the name of the new scholarship fund. At one counter, a young mother was opening her son's first savings account, met with none of the suspicion Marcus and Sophie had faced that same afternoon 3 months earlier. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Sophie watched the scene for a long moment before turning to her father and asking if that was the reason he hadn't simply closed the bank down after everything that happened. Marcus thought about it before answering, choosing his words carefully because he wanted her to actually understand them rather than simply hear them. Closing a door is easy, he told her. Making it open for everyone is harder. Sophie nodded slowly, the way she did when she was turning an idea over in her mind rather than simply accepting it. She looked back at the young mother at the counter, then up at her father again, as if measuring the distance between the anger she remembered from 3 months earlier and the calm she was watching unfold in front of her. Before they left, Marcus let Sophie hand the very first scholarship letter to a young student being raised by a single father, watching his daughter's face as she understood, for the first time, that $2 million had never been what made him matter. What mattered was that he'd had the power to seek revenge, and chose instead to make sure the next person through those doors would be treated like they belonged there from the start. Father and daughter walked out together, finally continuing the plans that had been interrupted 3 months earlier. A stop at the bookstore, then dinner at the diner with the window seat. If you had been standing in that lobby the day it all began, would you have stayed silent behind a raised phone? Or would you have been the first to stand up for a father and his daughter? A person should never need $6 million to be treated with basic respect. Marcus didn't win the day Renee's boss recognized him as a powerful investor standing in his own branch. The real victory only arrived once he used that same power to make sure the next person walking through those doors would be treated fairly. No matter who they were, what they wore, or how much money they carried with them. If this story moved you, subscribe for more, and carry that same lesson with you the next time you're standing in a room where someone else is being underestimated.